Now, the real question is going to be just how persuaded are businesses and consumers that a relatively low average effective tariff rate is going to stay in effect. That's to say, how persistent is the court's ruling going to prove, or is Trump going to try whatever other faculties are available to him to try to re-implement tariffs? And the reason why that matters so much is because the printed data are going to evolve according to how consumers are behaving. And if they think that Trump is still going to continue trying to implement tariffs using whatever other authorities are at his disposal, they're going to pull forward imports once again, as they did in the first quarter. And that's going to actually make the printed data a little bit worse. It's going to make growth a little bit worse. If they think that Trump is going to have to back off in light of the court's ruling, we could actually have a smoother GDP growth trajectory ahead, which puts the Fed a little bit at ease, and it allows the Fed to think maybe those inflation pressures are not going to materialize and they can resume cutting, albeit at a slower pace in the second half of the year.
So, Molly, you guys are twisting yourselves into pretzels to cover data and bring some kind of perspective and context, knowing that most of the time it's backward looking and the whole world has shifted under your feet. The Fed minutes, as I mentioned, were kind of the ultimate example of that. Like, well, policymakers are freaking out about tariffs, but that happened before the pause. So we crinkle that up and throw it away. What do you pay attention to?
I mean, I think like just building on what Stuart said here is that like the whole issue is that the uncertainty of where we go from here is still very much alive. Like, you know, is this trade court ruling the end all be all of what happens? Like, I tend to doubt it. I would think that Trump, like Stuart said, is going to try to do whatever he can to revive tariff policy to the extent that he's trying to. And that, remember, like, this is part of a whole bigger legislative agenda that he's trying to push through. And that with all of these things that are moving through with like the tax bill, a lot of this also depends on there being revenue from tariffs. And the ones right now that the court has blocked would be the ones that would generate the most revenue.
Baseline tariffs.
Those are the big ones.
Yes.
And the bigger reciprocal ones also, all of the ones that are paused right now. So I think right now, if just like you're looking at, you know, has uncertainty been absolved? I would say no. I think it's still very heightened, and who knows how businesses and consumers are going to respond then. So yes, the minutes, of course, incredibly backward looking. I mean, they came out before the pause on China. They came out before, obviously, this court ruling overnight. So who's to say where we go from here? It certainly, I think, would vindicate the Fed. And like, we're staying on pause right now. That really is the best course of action.
Talk about data dependent here. Boy, Stuart, you know, it's interesting. It's like a damned if you do situation, right? The markets freak out. We've got tariffs. Do you know what that's going to mean for inflation? We could have a recession around here, stagflation. You take the tariffs away and the bond market's suddenly upset that we're not raising money to help pay for tax cuts. Which is worse?
I think that's probably a little bit worse to maintain tariffs in place. What's a little bit tricky is that you read op-eds from Navarro, or you read other sort of analysis that's put out by the West Wing, and they hope to have the big, beautiful bill scored in a way that for some reason incorporates tariff revenue that comes from the West Wing, not from Congress. But this is exactly why tariff revenue and policy from the West Wing, rather than legislation, is excluded from CBO scoring. These are things that can go away with a pen stroke, and whether that's from a trade court judge or the next administration. And when that's the case, the bond market should keep its eye on the legislation. And the legislation right now scores as expanding the deficit by a few $1 trillion. And for that reason, the bond market should be relatively upset once again that this revenue is going away. It should have always been of the mindset that this tariff revenue could just go away.
So, but Molly, we get Republican lawmakers here every day who say, yeah, but you don't get it. The CBO is wrong. They should have dynamic scoring and factor in the growth that will come from the tax cuts. They're not going to do that. But is there some truth to it?
I mean, look, there is like some truth to the idea of looking at the totality of the policies, sure. But I think when
does that elusive growth, though? That's always the argument for tax cuts. Is it real?
I mean, yeah, who's like, how can you really sit here right now and know what that's going to produce? And the tariff effect still is just so fluid. And, you know, even if you are going to get like some bit of revenue from this, I think the argument all along has just been that like it's not going to be sustaining, and that the bond market should rightly focus on that. That, like, let's say that this court ruling didn't happen, that you're still going to have these punitive tariffs in place. At some point, people are going to be, stop importing all of this stuff because it's just prohibitively expensive to do so. That revenue is as such going to fall, and they're going to have to find other sources of making these goods. So it's really just not a sustainable source of revenue for the administration to count on, or for the bond market to count on.
Well, you know what? I'm going to ask you after this big windup. Now I'm going to ask you to look backward because we do have data to talk about here. I'm pretty sure, Molly, you were on the air with us when we got the first swing at GDP showing the downturn in the quarter. What's new, if anything, in this number?
So the biggest revision to the number today was really just looking at consumer spending, and that accounts for roughly 2/3 of GDP. So that grew at a slower pace in the first quarter than originally reported. That was the biggest takeaway for me, as well as looking at that the trade deficit was actually, or the impact from trade rather to GDP was even bigger than what we initially had seen. Granted, there were some factors that mitigated this, that it ended up being that GDP shrank at a lesser rate than initially reported. But I think like what seems to be the focus more is like these downside revisions to consumer spending and the trade deficit.
So you have a downturn here, Stuart, and you know what the next question is, are we in a recession? Is there one coming? Is this a one-off?
No, we're not in a recession. We are seeing some more precautionary savings on the part of consumers. Remember, though, that the savings rate is still exceptionally low. And so when there is going to be a retrenching of consumer spending, it's likely going to be more material than just a mere slowdown in PCE spending to a 1.2% annualized rate. I think that it is possible that we do see 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, but we still do have reasonably robust domestic final demand. That's to say consumer spending and fixed investment growth. And I think that that's what's more important than the headline GDP figures. We just got jobless claims this morning. Initial jobless claims still tame at about 240,000 for the week that just ended. And even though the labor market is cooling, the unemployment rate remains low. So not quite in a recession, or at least not one that would be judged to be not in an economic environment that would be judged to be a recession by the famous National Bureau of Economic Research.
Yeah, we learned a lot about that when we had the 2 consecutive quarters in the Biden administration, right? And I was schooled. It's not as simple as that. You guys have like 12 boxes to check before this really becomes a recession. So what's on your radar, Molly? Is it the next jobs report? What's going to matter in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, definitely. We've got the next jobs report due a week from tomorrow. And tomorrow we also get a look at April inflation adjusted spending. So that's going to be a big one to look at, just looking, what's the early indication in the second quarter of how things are panning out. I mean, it's, of course, GDP is such like an all-encompassing natural gauge to look at for like, how are we going to talk about the overall health of the economy? But like, as Stuart's talking about here, rightfully so, the trade impact right now is just really, it's really just clouding what like the underlying measures of consumer and business spending would tell you. And those are the right figures to look at right now.
Yeah, interesting. When are we going to see, Stuart, the impact in a jobs report of the DOGE? The federal worker layoffs, or is that not going to materialize in the hard data?
It's still pretty elusive. We are expecting to see a slowdown in the headline pace of hiring in the May jobs report. We're expecting to see about 90,000 jobs added, in part because of DOGE. When you look at the regional economic consequences of the pullback in government spending, the efficiency attempt, it does look to be the case that there are some regional consequences. At the national level, is a little bit less material, but when it comes to the labor market, uncertainty is the name of the game right now, and we are seeing the consequences of uncertainty, likely with just 90,000 jobs added in